The wind howled over the lonely plains of Montana, sweeping across the golden fields that stretched beyond the eye could see. And somewhere amid that endless quiet stood a small wooden cabin leaning against time itself. Inside, the faint cry of a baby cut through the silence like a prayer carried by the wind. Thomas Grayson, a cowboy once known for his laughter and the way he could tame the wildest stallion with a single look, now sat beside a cradle, his weathered hands trembling as he tried to warm a bottle that had long gone cold. His eyes were hollow, sleepless from nights spent pacing, praying and wondering how to keep his daughter alive since Sarah, his wife and the light of his world, had been buried 3 weeks ago under the same willow tree where he'd once promised her forever. The winter had come early that year, cruel and sharp. The cattle were thin, the land dry, and the small ranch that Thomas had built from scratch felt more like a graveyard of memories than a home. He'd been a man of strength, the kind who could work sunrise to sunset without complaint. But grief had stolen his fire, leaving only exhaustion behind. The baby's cries grew louder, shriller, desperate, and Thomas's throat tightened as he whispered, "I'm trying, sweetheart. Daddy's trying, but he wasn't. He was failing." The milk powder he'd been stretching for days was gone, and the last bottle had spilled earlier when his shaking hands couldn't hold steady. He looked at the tiny face of his daughter, Hannah, named after her mother, and the helplessness broke him in ways bullets or storms never could. He pressed his forehead against the cradle edge, fighting tears. Cowboys weren't meant to cry, but this one did. Outside, the wind blew harder, a storm brewing on the horizon. It was the kind of night that told stories of survival and miracles, though Thomas had stopped believing in both. As the sky darkened, he wrapped Hannah in a wool blanket, held her close to his chest, and sat by the fire that was more ember than flame. The ranch was quiet, except for the moan of the wind through broken boards. Then faintly at first, he thought he heard something, footsteps crunching through the snow. He looked up, startled, every muscle tensing. No one came out this far anymore, not since the accident that took Sarah. He set the baby down gently, reached for his shotgun by the door, and waited. The sound came again, closer this time, a shuffle, a pause, a cry. Then a knock, soft but frantic, rattled the door. He hesitated, heart pounding. "Who's there?" His voice came out rough. No answer, only another knock, weaker now. He opened the door, and the wind nearly tore it from his hand. Standing there was a woman, thin, drenched, clutching a bundle of rags. Her face was pale, lips blue, and her eyes, large and hollow like his own, were full of terror and exhaustion. "Please," she gasped, I need warmth. My baby's gone. I have nowhere left." Thomas froze, looking at her, at the trembling vigor of a woman who seemed half dead, but still fighting. "Get in before you freeze," he said quickly, pulling her inside and closing the door against the storm. She collapsed near the fire, breathing hard. Her hands shook as she reached toward the flame, trying to feel heat again. Thomas saw then the marks of hunger, cheeks sunken, wrists thin, eyes desperate. "What happened?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "Lost my home 2 nights ago. Husband died last winter. No family left. Been walking since morning." Her voice cracked, and Thomas felt the echo of his own pain in her words. 2 strangers, both widowed, both broken by the same merciless world. He poured her a cup of the last coffee he had and handed it to her. "Drink slow," he said. She took it with trembling hands, whispering a thank you so soft it almost disappeared in the crackle of the fire. The baby's cry rose again, thin and pitiful. The woman looked up, startled. "You have a child?" He nodded, his voice breaking. "A daughter. She's hungry, but I ran out of milk. Been trying to find someone who could help, but..." He stopped. There was no one. The townsfolk had turned distant since Sarah's death, whispering about curses and God's will. The woman set down the cup slowly and looked at the cradle. Her eyes softened, maternal instinct replacing fear. "Let me hold her," she said. Thomas hesitated only a second before nodding. The woman picked up the baby gently, whispering something under her breath, a mother's tone no grief could erase. Hannah quieted almost instantly, resting her tiny hand against the stranger's chest. It was as if she'd found comfort in the one thing. Thomas no longer knew how to give warmth. He watched silently, heart aching, and yet, for the first time in weeks, feeling a faint glimmer of peace. The woman rocked the baby softly until her cries turned to whimpers, then silence. The firelight played across her face, and Thomas saw the weariness melt away, replaced by something gentle, almost holy. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. She looked up. "Mary," she said. "Mary Collins." He nodded. "Thomas Grayson," she smiled faintly. "Your little girl's beautiful." "She's all I have left," he replied. Silence filled the cabin again, the kind that didn't hurt as much anymore. Outside, the storm roared, but inside there was warmth. Two broken souls and a child that tied them together in the simplest, most human way. Hours passed. Mary dozed by the fire with Hannah in her arms, and Thomas sat across from her, watching the flames dance. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight he didn't feel alone. There was something about her presence, a quiet strength, a light in the dark that made him believe maybe the world wasn't done being kind. As he stared at the flickering light, he whispered a prayer he hadn't said since Sarah's passing. "Thank you for sending someone." When dawn broke, soft and gold, the storm had passed. Thomas stepped outside, the air crisp, the world washed clean. He looked at the horizon and thought of how strange fate was, how sometimes help came not in riches or miracles, but in the shape of another broken heart. Behind him, he heard the baby stir and Mary's soft voice humming an old lullaby. He smiled faintly, whispering to the wind, maybe this is a new beginning. He didn't know it yet, but that knock on his door had changed everything. What started as two lives lost in sorrow would soon become a story of healing, love and redemption born from pain. If this story touched your heart, the narrator's voice softens at the end. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hope, courage, and unexpected miracles. Every click helps us share more light in a dark world. The morning sun broke through the clouds as though heaven itself had opened its arms over the lonely ranch. Thomas Grayson stood by the barn, hands rough from years of work, eyes fixed on the mountains that shimmered in the distance. The storm had passed, but inside him, the real storm was only beginning to calm. He could still hear the faint sound of laughter drifting from the cabin, the sound of Mary's voice as she spoke softly to Hannah. That sound, fragile yet warm, reminded him of life, returning to a place long abandoned by hope. For the first time in months, Thomas felt something other than grief, a quiet gratitude. He didn't know how long Mary would stay, or if she'd leave once she regained her strength. But he knew one thing: last night something had changed. Inside, the cabin glowed with soft light from the fire. Mary was sitting in the rocking chair, Hannah asleep in her arms. The tired lines on her face were still there, but her eyes had regained color, life. When Thomas stepped in, she looked up and smiled faintly. "You were up early," she said. "Habit," he replied. "The cattle don't wait." He set down his hat and poured 2 mugs of water. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she said quietly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's been a while since I slept in a warm room." Thomas nodded, unsure what to say next. He'd been alone so long that words felt like foreign tools in his mouth. "Thank you," she whispered suddenly. "You didn't have to help me last night." "But you did." He looked at her for a moment, then at the child in her arms. "Maybe I wasn't the one helping," he said softly. "Maybe it was you who helped me." The silence that followed was comfortable, the kind that fills a home when two souls finally stop running. Over the next few days, the rhythm of the ranch began to change. Mary helped wherever she could, mending torn clothes, cooking what little food they had left, and singing softly while Thomas worked outside. The baby grew calmer, healthier, her laughter echoing through walls that had known only sorrow. Thomas found himself drawn to that laughter, to Mary's steady voice, and to the way she moved through his world, like she'd been meant to be there all along. At night, after the chores were done and the world quieted, they would sit by the fire and share stories. Mary told him about the small town she came from, about her husband who died in a mining accident, about the nights she'd walked with nothing but faith to guide her. Thomas shared his own heartache, about losing Sarah during childbirth and the emptiness that followed. Each story was like a thread, weaving them together, binding two broken hearts into something whole again. One evening, the wind carried a chill again. Thomas came in with an armful of firewood, dusting snow from his coat. Mary looked up from where she was sewing. "Storm's coming again?" she asked. "Looks that way," he said, setting the wood down. "We'll be fine. Got enough supplies this time." He knelt beside the cradle, smiling as Hannah kicked her tiny feet in her sleep. "She's strong," Mary said, watching him. "Just like her father." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Maybe like both of us." Something unspoken passed between them, something fragile, almost sacred. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the fire casting gold light over their faces. Then Thomas turned away, clearing his throat. "You should rest. Long day tomorrow." "You too," she said softly. The next morning, the storm hit harder than expected. The wind screamed through the valley, rattling the windows, tearing at the roof. Thomas fought to secure the barn doors, while Mary held the baby close, whispering prayers into the storm. Hours passed before the winds finally eased. When Thomas came back in, soaked and freezing, Mary ran to him, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. "You could have been killed out there," she said, voice trembling. He smiled weakly. "Wouldn't be the first time the weather tried to take me down." She shook her head, tears brimming. "Don't joke like that. Not when—" She stopped, realizing her voice had cracked. He looked at her, his heart catching at the sight of her fear. "Mary," he said gently, "I'm still here." And then, without meaning to, his hand brushed against hers. She froze, eyes wide, but she didn't pull away. In that moment, words didn't matter. The firelight danced, the baby sighed in her sleep, and two souls finally stopped, pretending they were just surviving. They were living again. Days turned into weeks. The snow melted, and with it, the world began to bloom once more. The ranch, once a place of sorrow, now echoed with laughter, warmth, and the sounds of life. The townsfolk, who once whispered about the widowed cowboy cursed by fate, began to notice something different. When Thomas rode into town with Mary beside him and the baby in her arms, people didn't see tragedy anymore. They saw a man who had found grace again. But fate wasn't done testing them. One evening, as Thomas worked the fences, a familiar figure appeared on horseback. "Sheriff Lane." He dismounted with a heavy look. "Thomas," he said, "you need to know something." Thomas's gut tightened. "What is it?" The sheriff sighed. "There's talk in town. Mary's passed. Someone's looking for her." Thomas stiffened. "Looking for her?" "A man from the next county. Says she ran away from a boarding house that owed him money. Claims she took something that wasn't hers." Thomas felt his chest tighten. He couldn't imagine Mary doing anything wrong, but the world was cruel to women with no home. And he knew too well that desperation could make anyone act out of survival. That night he confronted her gently. "Mary," he said quietly, "is there something you haven't told me?" She looked down, tears forming. "I didn't steal," she whispered. I left because he tried to take advantage of me. I ran to protect myself. And then the blizzard hit. I swear, Thomas, I never wanted to bring trouble to your door." He reached out, lifting her chin. "You didn't bring trouble," he said firmly. "You brought life back to this place. You saved my daughter, and maybe me too." Her tears spilled freely. And before she could speak, he pulled her into his arms. For the first time in years, Thomas held someone without feeling the weight of the past, only the warmth of now. Months later, spring painted the valley green again. The ranch flourished, the cattle strong, and laughter filled the air daily. Mary stayed, not as a guest anymore, but as part of the family. One morning, Thomas rode to town, and when he returned, he knelt before her on the porch, holding a small wooden box. Inside was a simple silver ring, polished from years of wear, Sarah's old wedding band. "I don't know what the future holds," he said quietly, "but I know I want you and Hannah to have a home here. With me." Mary covered her mouth, tears spilling again. "Thomas, you don't have to answer now," he said softly. "Just know that this place, my heart, it's yours if you want it." She didn't need words. Her tears and trembling smile said everything. And as the sun set over the fields, Thomas took her hand, and for the first time in a long, long while he felt peace. Not the peace of silence or solitude, but the peace of belonging. The story of the widowed cowboy and the starving mother became one whispered through generations in the valley, a story not of miracles or wealth, but of kindness, courage, and the way love can bloom even in the hardest soil. If this story touched your heart, the narrator's voice fades softly at the end. Don't forget to subscribe and share. Every story we tell reminds us that no heart is too broken to heal, and no storm lasts forever.